Yes. Amos chapter 2. This is Amos part 4. Amos 2 verse 5. He's been giving us all of the judgments on these other nations, and now it's gone to the Israelites. Verse 5, But I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they sold the righteous for silver, and the poor for a pair of shoes. Whew. Feels like that's going on now. The rich keep getting richer, and the poor keep getting poorer, and in ways that they never imagined they would get poor in. What's going on here is bribes. The judges, the judicial class was being bribed by rich people. Well, I think that's kind of every nation's downfall, is when their judges, the people responsible for carrying out the law, are not trustworthy. You've got a mob that's ruling, and that's basically what's going on. In Deuteronomy 16 verse 19, this is unforgivable for Israel. Other nations, they didn't have God set down laws for them. So for them, it's kind of hunt and peck and figure out what works and what doesn't. But Israel has no excuse. Deuteronomy 16 verse 19. This is the law God gives them. Thou shalt not wrest judgment. Thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift. He told them from the beginning, somebody's going to want to try to bribe you. Don't do that. He says, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the words of the righteous. Isn't that the truth? Watch them go into Congress. It seems like they go in good, and maybe they are. But if they stay there for 20 years, they've been taking some bribes. More than likely. I mean, you'll find some exceptions, maybe. I haven't found one. Maybe you have. But if they're there for very long, I think that the gift-giving, bribing thing just gets more than they can handle, and most of them succumb to it. Okay, they picked the shoes off. Now, the shoes, it could mean that they're stealing shoes because they want shoes. But I doubt you want a poor person's shoe. What was so desirable was the land. We've seen that in previous verses, that they wanted the land, the actual ground. And every other nation wants that land. It's just a little bitty old slip of land. It's not really that big a deal. But they want it because it's God's, and they don't even realize that. What happened in the Old Testament was your title deed for your property could transfer with your shoe. You find that in Ruth. Ruth chapter 4, verse 7. Ruth 4, verse 7. Now this was the manner in the former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing, for to confirm all things. A man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was a testimony in Israel. Okay, so he said, okay, I know that's Joe Blow's shoe over there you got, so you must have done a land deal. That's your title deed. Could you imagine that nowadays? But now, you remember Israel had some real strict rules on that property. It couldn't just be sold back and forth. You could sell it in certain situations, but then after 7 years it had to return to the original family. So there's no excuse in Israel for this land to just go changing hands willy-nilly like this. Look at it in Psalms. Now that you found Ruth, look at Psalms chapter 60, verse 8. Psalm 60, verse 8. God gets in on this deal and says, I'll change out my land the same way y'all do. Psalm 60, verse 8. Moab is my wash pot. Okay, so I'm going to do the dirty laundry over there in Moab. Over Edom will I cast out my shoe. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. So he says, I'm going to sell Israel to Edom and the Philistines. Whew. He's giving them his shoe. He's casting it out. Just like that. So that's that land deal. The land, everybody covets that land. Early on in the Bible, God says, I'm dividing this land up between the 12 tribes, and I'm going to set some rules in place. So even if you get in trouble and you needed some money, you could sell it back and forth. But after 7 years, it's going right back, so it stays in the tribes that I've allotted it to. God's really particular about it. They took these poor people and they drove them off their land. The same thing's going on right now. Bill Gates is buying up farmland. He ain't no farmer. But he's buying it up. You can count on it. He's got some plot in his head that he's going to do with this land. It's not just so that he can get into farming. No, he's got some other means in mind. Well, that's what these rich people do, and that's what they were doing in the Old Testament. Look at Matthew 23. Matthew 23:14. He says, Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Okay, these are the ruling class, the highfalutin people. For you devour widows' houses. You know, they've got a thing right now that you can do. You can, in fact, I looked into it when I was a young man. You can buy up tax deeds. So if somebody owes taxes on their house that they've not paid, you can buy the tax deed. And then eventually it keeps mounting, and there's no way for them to pay for their deed that now you own. And so in essence, you now own the house. You can take over somebody's house that way. I looked into it. It looked like a great deal, but it just sounded so mean. I couldn't do it. Take somebody's house. But that's kind of what's going on in this verse. They're taking over a widow's house, and by devious means. It's just not, there's no mercy. Titus chapter 1. Titus 1 verse 12. They're very similar to the heathen. Here's the heathen. It says, one of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. That's what separated Israel from the pagans. Was Israel acted like they were human. The pagans acted like an animal. They just bought and craved everything they could get their hands on. And here Paul says, one of their own people was saying, we're all just a bunch of evil beasts. We'll lie and steal and cheat and whatever we got to do to get on top. Okay, well, Israel was supposed to be different because they served God. God gave them some rules. Back to Amos 2. Amos 2 verse 7. So we just saw him stealing the shoe, and now this kind of connects with the same train of thought. Verse 7. That pant after the dust of the earth. Okay, that's, they want the ground. On the head of the poor, and turn aside the way of the meek. And a man and his father will go in unto the same maid to profane my holy name. They pant, that is, they covet land. I've never been big on houses. You know, a big house didn't really. Then you got to keep it up, and you. That just doesn't sound like fun to me. But land, I always liked hunting, so I liked land. I mean, that'd be a nice thing to have, a bunch of land somewhere. And that's what was going on here, was they were coveting this land. Look at it in Amos 4. Amos 4 verse 1. Hear this word, ye kine of Bashan. Now he's talking to the nation, and he's calling them a bunch of cows. Ye kine of Bashan. Okay, so what does a cow need? A cow needs a lot of land, needs some pasture. That are in the mountains of Samaria, which oppress the poor, which crush the needy, which say to their masters, bring and let us drink. You know what a cow does? A cow does nothing productive. The most productive thing a cow does is get slaughtered. He just says, let me eat, let me eat. Now, unfortunately, that's the way most churches have become. The preacher stands in the pulpit and he's got two sermons. I preached one of them today. He has two sermons. The sermons are, come to church, and the second sermon is, give me money. That's a cow. That's what a cow does. Cow says, come here and give me something to eat. That's not the right message. Now, hopefully I put a little different spin on it than what these modernists are doing. Okay, 1 Kings 21. 1 Kings 21, verse 4. Here's a great type of the Antichrist that does this. And Ahab, you remember Ahab and Jezebel. And Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased because of the word of Naboth, the Jezreelite, had spoke to him. For he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. You can't have my land. And he laid him down on his bed and turned away his face and would eat no bread. He was so mad it just ruined his dinner. He's pouting in the corner now because he's king and somebody dared to tell him, you can't have my land. Well, you can't. He thought he was a dictator, and he wasn't. In Proverbs 28, verse 21. He says, to have respect of persons is not good. You know, that's really hard to not do. You have respect of persons. I mean, you got to fight against it, but you do. Somebody you like, you respect more than the bum on the street, don't you? Sure. To have respect of persons. You know, there is wisdom in all men. He says that a wise man will draw it out. A wise man knows how to get the wisdom out of somebody, whether they realize they have it or not. You could talk to a bum and learn how he wound up on the street and learn not to do those things. He didn't learn that lesson. But if you're wise, you can draw that wisdom out of him. Okay, so don't be so highfalutin that you can't talk to the bum. We should be able to condemn the men of low estate. He says, for a piece of bread, that will a man transgress. You get really hungry, and you get used to having respect and feeling like you're owed something, then for a piece of bread, you'll give away anything. You'll transgress God's commands. Micah chapter 2, verse 2. Micah 2, verse 2. Here's where it gets really bad. And it's getting that way in the world. The world right now, you've got to watch the news, not in America, but foreign news. And you'll find out how bad things are worldwide. People are killing and stealing and robbing, and the government's behind it. Micah 2:2. And they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man in his house, even a man in his heritage. That's exactly what Ahab did. That was the man's inheritance, and he took it by violence. Look at verse 9. The women of my people have ye cast out from their pleasant houses, from their children have ye taken away my glory forever. God talks about Israel. Israel doesn't own any of their children. You know, the way the government thinks they own ours. But God says, those were my children that you sacrificed to Moloch and to Baal. Okay, so really, had God not opened the womb, there would have been no child. So in essence, they're his. But here he's saying they're taking away the children. They're casting the women out of their own houses. I guess a house is a big thing for a woman. You know, that's their place, and they want to decorate it and do all the fluffy stuff to it. Man just wants to come home and have a place to sleep. Good table to eat at. Look at Micah chapter 7. Micah 7 verse 2. It says, the good man is perished out of the earth. Well, when you've got a bunch of mob mentality people running around and stealing property, and he said they were doing it by violence, you kind of have to compete on the same playing field. So you got to be violent to protect it. And if you're not careful, that violence becomes satanic. And then you just become a man of violence. That'd be a tough one to fight. And there is none upright among them. They all lie in wait for blood. They hunt every man his brother with a net. We would hunt fish that way with a net. I don't know how you hunt people with a net, but that's what they're doing. They're setting a trap. Look at verse 3, Micah 7:3. That they may do evil with both hands earnestly. The prince asketh, and the judge asketh for a reward. You know, they do that in Mexico. You can't get anything done without a bribe. In America, I think America is odd for this among the other nations. We tip. And the other nations come over here and go to a restaurant. They don't understand what a tip is because they're used to just paying the bill. And if you wanted more, you should put it on the bill. But we think you got good service, so you do somebody else good too. But here he says, the judge is asking for a reward. Hey, I'll rule in your favor if it's good for me. The great man, he uttereth his mischievous desire. So they wrap it up. Okay, whoever is the richest of the two men in court is going to come out on top because he's going to have the better gift to give the judge. That's bribery at its worst. Zephaniah 3:3. It says, her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bones till the morrow. Okay, so he's saying that the good people, the people that you have to answer to, are just as wicked as they can be. That'd be a tough way to live. You'd want to then go be a hermit somewhere. And this is what Israel has turned into. And God says, because you've been acting this way, and that's traditionally the way the heathen have, and you're supposed to be different than the heathen, I'm going to have to punish you for this. And he will. Amos 2 verse 7. After the first comma there he says, and turn aside the way of the meek. Meek is not weak, but it sure can be perceived as weak. Meek is, I am teachable. I'm humble. The Bible says that Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. Well, he did some things that were not weak by any stretch of the imagination. But the sum total of his life is he was always teachable by God. When God says, I didn't say stop at the Red Sea, go down there and lift up your rod. He didn't say this has gotten to be too much, I check out. And over, God asked him to do some wild stuff, and you don't see him doubting about it. Now, you see him lose his temper here and there, whatever. He's, in my book, he's justified in doing so. Not God's, I understand that. Amos 5, look at verse 12. Amos 5:12. It says, for I know your manifold transgressions and your mighty sins. Okay, so here's God saying not all sins are the same. Your mighty sins. Here's some that are high on his list. They afflict the just. They take a bribe, and they turn aside the poor in the gate from their right. Whew. Now, they wouldn't do that from someone who was strong enough to keep them from doing it. You would just naturally protect what is yours. That's normal. But when the judge comes in, when it seems like it's the legal thing, and he says, no, you've got to give me your land. I've got it right here. We just passed an ordinance that the king gets 10% of everybody's land. Then you would think, okay, that's That's the ruling. And being meek, you would give it up. God says, I don't put up with that. You're going to answer to a higher judge than the one appointed by that governor down there. Isaiah chapter 10. Isaiah 10 verse 2. To turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey. I mean, how tough is that? You got to go beat up on a widow? And that they may rob the fatherless. Going after kids. We don't think of it, but it's a fact. God is not so mad at Israel without a cause. Israel had become very wicked. For some reason, we seem to gloss over that. The Bible doesn't. Israel had become just as wicked or worse than the heathen. And we know how vicious and mean the heathen were. He said, my people, there's no excuse, and I'm going to have to punish them. Even though he's made some great promises to them, he's going to restore them. That punishment won't last forever, but they're not going to get away with it. Amos 2, verse 7, let's pick up another phrase. He says, and a man and his father will go into the same maid to profane my holy name. That is, they've got lewd desires. They're living out what we see nonstop on TV. I don't know why it is. I do know why it is. It's satanic. But they'll portray that garbage on every show. Pure wickedness, and everybody cheating with everybody, and everybody smiles and nobody cares. Then the second it happens in real life, they act like it was such a horrible thing. Wait a minute, you've been watching it on your TV shows nonstop every day. What do you think people are going to do? Of course they're going to. Leviticus 18, verse 8. Leviticus 18, verse 8. He said, the nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. Now this is a fact. God forbid the marriage of, or the joining of the child and mother relationship. That's wickedness. That was pagan. And he said, I don't want to see that in Israel. Leviticus 18, verse 15. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy daughter-in-law. She is thy son's wife. Okay? It's like God says there's boundaries. Man doesn't like to hear that. Now, you would think these are normal things that you wouldn't do anyway, but the pagans were doing them. And I'll bet you it won't be long before America legalizes every one of these things. They've already gone way beyond what should have made sense anyway. So they'll just go right on down the list, ticking off every law God's made, if they can get away with it. Ezekiel 22, verse 11. Ezekiel 22, 11. And one hath committed abomination with his neighbor's wife, and another hath lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law, the thing he said don't do. And another in thee hath humbled his sister, his father's daughter. He said, we've got all this incest. Now, that was not something that was taboo even 300 years ago. In England, that's the way they came to the throne, was you intermarried in the family. Well, God said don't do that. There's a reason God said don't do that. You start getting problems. You start getting physical problems because God already knew that. Your DNA doesn't match right, and you start having health issues. Well, God was trying to prevent some problems, not be a mean ogre. Well, they found out the hard way. 1 Corinthians 5:1. 1 Corinthians 5:1. You don't really have to understand all the reasons why God says what he says. If you know God, you know it's for your good. He's not just making up a rule because he wants to show how powerful and how many things he can make you not do. It's for your good. These things are health issues. He says in 1 Corinthians 5:1, it's commonly reported, it is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. Now, you look at that verse and you think, how in the world could this church be doing something that even the pagans didn't do? He didn't say the pagans didn't do it. He said it wasn't named. That was still hush-hush among the pagans. The pagans were still doing it. You can count on it. It just wasn't a common thing they had a normal name for. He said that's how wicked. So that tells you something. A Christian can get involved in all the same mess that the lost world is in. The farther you get from God and the farther you get from trying to obey his rules, the more like his children Israel, or the people that got in trouble in the New Testament in the beginning, we become. So it's important to find some rules in the Bible and start obeying them, because then you'll start recognizing them. Here's what you do. The first time you decide you want to obey what God has to say, you do this. You say, okay, wherever you are in your Bible reading, okay, God, you show me a rule and I'll obey it. I'm gonna obey that one. You determine it, and then you'll see so many of them. He'll be shotgunning them at you, just left and right, and then get you a pen and paper and get with it. But you don't even recognize that they're there before that. The heart's got to be right. When the heart's right, that Bible comes to life. Amos 2, let's look at the next thing in our passage. Amos 2, verse 7, he says, this is all done to profane my holy name. Now, that sounds scary. God says, you're doing all of this to get back at me. Woo-wee. Now, they didn't think they were doing that. They thought they were doing it for their pleasure. But he says, no, you're not made for your pleasure anyway. You're made for my pleasure. And when you decide to do something I've said don't do, you're doing that to get back at me and profane my name. Whew. Leviticus 20, look at verse 3. Leviticus 20, verse 3. God says, and I will set my face against that man, and will cut him off from among his people, because he hath given his seed unto Moloch, to defile my sanctuary, and to profane my holy name. I'm not going to say it for sure. Y'all research it and study it. But it looks like this is a way you would lose your salvation in the Old Testament. He said he's going to cut you off from your people. Well, when you died in the Old Testament, that's how you went to Abraham's bosom, as you were gathered to your people. He says if somebody does some of these things, I cut them off from their people. That would be hell. Look at it in 2 Samuel 14. 2 Samuel 12, verse 14. Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. Now, David had great, he was an exception to the rule in the Old Testament. He was given what was called the sure mercies of David. He didn't know it, but he was given New Testament salvation in the Old Testament. God did not take the Holy Spirit from him. And he did something that there was no way that a man could pay for. Adultery and murder. You know what those things have in common? Death penalty. There's no sacrifice you can give. There's no atonement no payment you can make to the offended party. No, it's penalty of death for those. But God forgave him. He was given something special, just like we are in our dispensation. But that doesn't mean he was altogether unpunished. His child had to die. Ezekiel 36, verse 20. Ezekiel 36:20. And when they entered unto the heathen, whither they went, they profaned my holy name, when they said unto them, these are the people of the Lord, and are gone forth out of his land. He says they had to go in here with these heathen, and We got to work with them nonstop every day. Wouldn't it be nice if you could get saved and you could join a convent somewhere and nothing but great people like yourself? Doesn't work that way, though. You got to go right back out there and work with the same heathen, and they don't care. And if you're not careful, you'll slip up and start profaning his name, because that'd be the comfortable thing to do. No, when you're out there amongst the heathen in their land, you still got to be a witness. And there ain't nothing easy about that. I like what they used to call a church. They used to say what they call now an auditorium. They call it a sanctuary. That's like a wildlife sanctuary. You're protected in there. That's the way it ought to feel. If you've been living like you're supposed to live day to day out in the world, you want to get to the church where there's a sanctuary. You can let your guard down for a minute. And you can relax. That's the way it ought to be. Romans 2, verse 24. Romans 2, verse 24. The problem with Christians is, for some reason, when you get saved, you become a leader, whether you intend to or not. And if a Christian decides to be wicked, he ends up being more wicked than his wicked friends. He becomes the ringleader for wickedness. I don't know why that is, but it is. Romans 2:24. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. Whew. That's a fact. Christians, if they let their guard down and they want to impress the world, you know how they're going to impress the world? They're going to try to show the world they're more worldly than they are. And it becomes a competition of who's the most wicked. And so it's a slippery slope. That's what Israel did, was they got on that thing. They were out there with the heathen. First of all, they wanted to appeal to the heathen. And, get all the trade deals and, be buddies with the other heathen. It began way early on when they wanted a king because they were looking at the other nations. And you can see that progression as it just slowly went, and they pretty soon out-wicketed the wicked. Amos 2, verse 8. Amos 2, verse 8. And they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge by every altar, and they drink the wine of the condemned in the house of their God. Now, it's getting heavy duty here, but remember, he's not talking about heathen here. If you separated this and just read that one verse, you would think that's talking about a heathen somewhere. He's not talking about the heathen here. He's talking about his people. That's bad news. Okay, he says they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge. Okay, so what is that talking about? He's talking about if somebody's going to promise to do something, you want a down payment. So I should do this. I've never thought of it. I ought to do this. I have the homeless come by and want to do work for me, for $20 or what? Well, not $2, whatever it is. I don't give them money. I'll give them food, but sometimes I give them money. But what they would do in the old days is they would take a pledge from them to guarantee they're going to get some work out of them. So the standard thing is take their jacket. He won't be gone. He'll be back because he needs that jacket when it gets nightfall and it gets cold. So you keep that jacket. That ensures you've got some sort of confidence that he's going to finish the job. And he'll come back by nightfall and you can give him the jacket back and job's done. You can inspect it, whatever. Well, he says these people were keeping the jacket. They weren't returning it. That was the pledge that I'll finish this job. You gave them the jacket, and the mean man wouldn't return it to you at nightfall. Deuteronomy 24, verse 12. Deuteronomy 24, verse 12. He's given the law here on how things are to be done. Everything is covered in the law. The law covers so many fine, minute details it'll blow your mind. He says, and if the man be poor, thou shalt not sleep with his pledge. That is, don't keep it overnight. Return it to him before you go to bed. That was a pledge. That was a promise. And the promise was not just on his part that I'll do the work. The promise is on your part that you will return it. And God says, I oversee that. Exodus 22, verse 26. Exodus 22, 26. He says, if thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, just what we've been talking about, thou shalt deliver it unto him, by that the sun goeth down. It's very clear. If you took his scarf and you think, hey, that's a nice warm scarf, I think I'll use that tonight. Or you think maybe he didn't do enough of the work and you're just going to keep it until the job gets completed. He says, no, you can't do that. It's nighttime. I don't care if it was part of the promise. You return it to him at night and you can get it back in the morning. But at night time's when he needs it, and that's when you return it. You know, God forced them to be nice, whether they wanted to be or not. That's something about being civilized. Being civilized is not something that evolution created. It's something God created. You look at the rules that God came up with versus what they were doing in Egypt, and it'll blow your mind. The Egyptians were mean. God's rules were very nice. Like this right here. Somebody gives you a pledge, you got to return it. He says, back in our verse, in verse 8, Amos 2:8. He says, they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge by every altar. Okay, so they've made this into something religious. Now, isn't that the way to cover sin? Is to put some kind of religious phrasing on it? They were doing it in Jesus' time. He says, you want to steal money? Just call it Corbin. Call it Corbin. You don't have to give that money to your parents. We'll call it Corbin. You can bring it down to the temple. After your parents die, we'll split it with you. Okay, but it sounded religious, so they get away with it. Well, that's what they're doing here. They've got an altar, but this altar is not a good one. Now, obviously, it was not God's altar, and it was not being used the way it should be. Jeremiah 11, verse 12. Jeremiah 11:12. Then shall the cities of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem go and cry unto the gods, plural, small case, unto whom they offer incense. But they shall not save them at all in the time of their trouble. So that's what Israel and Judah had begun doing, is acting pagan. And not just acting it, they became more pagan than the pagan. And they had them some little gods. And they built them some altars to it. Bad news. Look at Jeremiah 32. Jeremiah 32, verse 29. And the Chaldeans that fight against this city shall come and set fire on the city and burn it with the houses. Upon the roofs they have offered incense unto Baal and poured out drink offerings unto their gods, lowercase g, to provoke me to anger. Whew. God says, I don't care if you've promised to another god. That one's not real anyway, and he answers to me. He says in Psalms that he stands in the congregations of the gods to judge. He does. There's no God higher than mine. Matter of fact, any God you create's got to answer to mine. That's what he says. And he says, if you start serving one of these gods in opposition to what I've told you, I count it as an affront to me. And that's why he says he's going to burn up their houses, because they've gone up to the roof. There's something about high places. They love these high places. And they would go up on these high places. If it was just the roof of their house, they would go up there and offer incense to Baal and pour out drink offerings. And God says, that just provokes me to anger. The drink offering, of course, was the incense that was supposed to be, that's the imitation of the incense that was supposed to be given on the altar the way God set it up. In Revelation, he explains that to you. Incense actually is prayer. That's what the picture of it was. In Revelation, he says the angel pours out the vial of incense on the altar. The incense is the prayer of the saints. Okay, so when we pray, it's incense that goes on God's altar. He says you violate that picture and it means something, even though they didn't understand it. God was big on these pictures in the Old Testament, and he had all these rules and regulations because they pictured something that we're supposed to understand. He said in our verse in Amos 2 verse 8, they drink the wine of the condemned. Whew. Okay, so this is wine that's offered to devils. That's demonic. That's a ceremonial offering to a god that's demonic. It's not our God. Look at it in Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32:32. Deuteronomy 32:32. For their vine is the vine of Sodom, and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are the grapes of gall. Their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the poison of dragons and the cruel venom of asps. There's nothing in the Bible that's good about a dragon. I know on the little cartoons and stuff, they act like there's something good about a dragon. There ain't nothing good about a dragon. Here he says, what the world drinks is the poison of dragons. Ugh. He says, that's their vine. Well, what did Jesus say? He says, I am the vine. My Father's a husband. Okay, he's a vine too. There's two different types of vines. There's a good one and a bad one. And the bad one is the juice, the wine that would be used in the celebration for the devil. The devil wouldn't want to see any of God's vine. No, he's got his own, an imitation. And there it is, and they do use it. Psalm chapter 16. He says, their sorrow shall be multiplied that hasten after another god. Their drink offerings, here's the drink offering, of blood will I not offer, nor take up their names unto my lips. Now I know there's plenty of ways that you can spiritualize that and try to make it sound nice, but it's not nice. And I think it means literally what he said, blood offering, drinking blood. That's just pagan as it can get. And it's going back that way, and I'm not going. That's Psalm 16, verse 4. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 21, Paul confronts it too. 1 Corinthians 10:21. He says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. So there's some drink that goes into the worship of the devil, into that devil worship. And if you get into all that satanic ritualistic practices they do, it's all just as wicked as what it appears in black and white in the Bible. The cup of the devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. You can't. Now, I'm going to tell you you can, but you can't. You can't do it at the same time. The problem with man is we're schizo. With the flesh, we can serve the flesh. And then in the spirit, we can serve God. But you can't do them both at the same time. You're either concentrating on one or the other. I might come to church and be preaching a message and be thinking, about anything else. Okay? Well, I'm not really doing both. My mind, where I'm at, 100% internally is what God's counting. So your actions may say one thing, but what your innards are saying, God's hearing. Man looks on the outward appearance, God looks on the heart. Okay, we better stop it there. We'll pick it up at Amos 2, verse 9 next time, and that's going to get into the Amorites.